Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. Also acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors of African descent who came before us to this land. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Francis. This is about 60% of my normal voice. I apologize in advance if I start to get a little croaky as we move on here. Dealing with whatever summer cold decided to find its way into my house this past number of weeks. But happy to be with you all today. I'm here with a number of members of what I guess we call our literacy intervention lead team. So I'm the principal of Glasgow Academy. And I have with me today, I have Janet Belgnasse, who is the Student Services Coordinator for the CCRCE. Caitlin Mansfield is joining us virtually. She's the speech language pathologist that serves, among other schools, in Glasgow Academy. I have Christine Williams, Student Services Consultant with CCRCE. Kyla McLeod, a school psychologist, who again, among other schools, serves in Glasgow Academy. I have Kim Bain, and Kim Bain, our learning support teacher, works with students in primary to 3 here at NGA. So happy to be here this afternoon to share a bit of NGA's story through the MTSS lens and a bit of what we've been trying to do to respond to student need around literacy achievement. The purpose of today, really within that MTSS lens, is to talk about kind of where we started with all of this, what kind of brought us to a literacy intervention that was developed in-house and with some support of some outside folks, and talk to you a little bit about what we've done, what impact has it had, and where are we going next. It's a story of tentative success. It is not a final book written. We like to say that we have a few chapters of this story written so far, but we're excited for September and the chapters to come next. So what'll happen is I'm going to share my screen. We'll take you through a bit of a PowerPoint, and then as each presenter joins, we're just going to slide in and out of a chair, kind of do this in a bit of an old school way. They'll slide in, they'll introduce themselves, and they'll talk a bit about their part. Our goal is to present for about 40 minutes. Might not take that long, but we certainly want to leave some time for questions or feedback. In the spirit of our not yetness, we still have lots of learning left to do, and excited for any input that any of you might have, or any of your wonderings that might inform our next steps. So I'll share my screen. And let me just, we'll get going. So a little bit of context for you. New Glasgow Academy, you'll never believe this, is in New Glasgow. We are a pre-primary to 8 school. We have approximately 600 students. We serve the east side of New Glasgow for pre-primary to grade 6, and then all students who would have gone to A.G. Bailey Memorial, serving the west side of the town, would join us for grade 7 and 8. We have French immersion just in 7 and 8, so all of our primary to grade 6 students would be in an English stream. We have a significant population of African Nova Scotian descent students, so approximately 15% of our students would be of African Nova Scotian descent. A smaller percentage, around 5% or maybe 3% of our students would be of Indigenous descent. And we also have a large population of newcomers to Canada. So a number of Syrian refugee families, for example, find their home in the east side of New Glasgow. And so what I would like to think that we have quite a diverse population that we serve here at NGA. My personal experience, I'm moving into my 4th year as principal, and that the context of my experience is a little bit relevant, because when I joined this school, I had come out of working in high schools as a high school teacher, as a student success planning consultant for CCRCE. And so I'd had the opportunity to kind of see what happens after elementary school, after middle school in the high schools, and then also had, as a consultant, an opportunity to travel around CCRCE and work with schools on their student success plan. So I got to see a lot of what was happening in schools around literacy, that being the SSP, one of the SSP goals. And I came to NGA. NGA had been identified by our region as a priority school. which effectively meant that we'd had a number of years of low academic achievement on particularly provincial assessments, and some school-based data would have supported that as well. But there had been, effectively unfortunately, a long history of students not meeting what we'd hope would be the expectations for them, particularly in literacy. So I joined the school not knowing a whole lot about how to teach reading, in fact, knowing almost nothing about how to teach reading. But I did have the opportunity to form a lot of relationships with teachers and support staff here at NGA. And what I immediately found was that the depth of care, integrity, enthusiasm of these teachers was second to none. I would have been happy. I have small children of my own. I would have been happy placing my kids in any of these teachers' classes. And I got to know, as I got to know them, I got to, form that relationship where we were able to talk a bit about their own practice, their own challenges, what they thought was working in classrooms, and what was still not yet for them. So in those conversations, I was lucky enough to have a school psychologist who you'll meet here, and student speech language pathologist, again, Caitlin, who you'll meet in a moment, stop me in the hallway one day and say, Andrew, can we talk to you about literacy? Can we talk to you about reading? And knowing very little, I said, yes, please, let's set that up. In the meantime, those two individuals were having conversations with Kim Bain, who you'll also meet, around her work as a learning support teacher, an experienced, exceptional classroom teacher who had moved into the resource type role, and who was also struck by some of the barriers that kids were still encountering in their literacy achievement. And we started having conversations about what works and what doesn't for kids. And we tried to start thinking about what might be different, what could be different for those kids if we really thought about the ways in which students learn to read and how we could systematically and intentionally teach to that process. And so this is kind of how our story started, was Andrew, can we talk to you about reading? And me being excited to learn from these exceptional people that populate the halls of NGA. So what did we try to do? Well, what we wanted to do was increase student literacy achievement. And our argument was, we don't really care what the books are that we use to test that, or what the assessment is that we use to assess that. But we want students to, if they have a developmentally appropriate book put in front of them, they know how to read it. They know how to attack it. They know what to do when they get stuck. And they have strategies that they can draw on to build their own literacy and reading capacity. So what we tried to do is have a bit of a strategy around that. And that's really what the story is here today. So our strategy really is grounded in, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Scarborough's reading rope. We have it up on the screen here. And really this reflects the simple view of reading. So the combination, the multiplication of language comprehension and word recognition. And in working with the staff at NGA here, what we kind of came to understand is that language comprehension, those strands that make that up, and you can see that on the screen, was something our teachers were already quite strong with. Through the Fountas and Pinnell, the level literacy interventions, we've done a lot around the background knowledge and the comprehension piece. But what we were really beginning to realize was that the word recognition strand was something that we needed to pay a lot more attention to and get more explicit in our teaching. So we started this past year, we tried on some diagnostic tools last year, just around phonological awareness and decoding in particular, to see where the students were at. So we wanted to know were our suppositions right? So did kids struggle to decode? Did they struggle to make those connections between the sounds and the letters on the page? So we did some initial screening last year, and yep, as you can imagine, those were some gaps. We were in the middle of COVID, and we were trying to think about, how do we build teacher capacity around these areas to improve student achievement? What we ended up doing was collecting some screener data, trying to build some initial teacher capacity, but really build a lot of those conversations for teachers to be vulnerable in discussing what they were doing in their classroom and what they felt was working and what wasn't. Building up some safety so that teachers felt comfortable saying, this isn't working, I'm stuck on this kid, and it not being a personal condemnation of teachers and their teaching, but rather a problem with the tools and the strategies that they had at hand. And how do we build up that toolbox and those strategies for teachers to respond to any student with any particular literacy challenge? So this past January, the lead team, again, who I introduced and you'll meet in a moment, we presented to the full staff virtually about a bit around the science of reading. And those words carry with them quite a bit of weight right now in terms of like the ideas of reading wars and structured literacy and balanced literacy and all that kind of stuff. But what we really wanted to do was ground our teachers in understanding of this is how a neurotypical brain learns how to read. Because our teachers had reported that they'd never learned how people had learned to read. They learned how to teach a form of teaching reading without that foundational knowledge to start from and to problem solve from. So we started at the very beginning because our teachers had reported that they hadn't been given that beginning. So we started with a presentation about how individuals learn to read, how the brain works, Scarborough's reading rope, that kind of stuff. That was in January. And then in March, we built some screeners. We didn't build the screeners, we employed some screeners, and Christine Williams is going to talk a little bit more about that. So we could collect the data and then respond through the MTSS lens, through the inclusive ed lens, appropriately for Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instruction. So who needs what, when, and where? So based on those needs, we built a professional learning plan for the teachers and really empowered our teachers to respond to the students in front of them and not say, look, I've done everything I can. It's time for somebody else to worry about them, but really having that hand in glove approach among our literacy strategies, among our student service strategies, to recognize that these are all our kids and this is all our work. The underlying elements to all of this, really, it's important to highlight that we use that inclusive ed policy, the guiding principle, number one, was that we honestly believe that every student can learn with enough time, practice, and equitable and responsive teaching. We didn't say, well, we did everything we could and now they're somebody else's problem. Fundamentally, our teachers believed that they could have an impact, and yes, they would need supports. Yes, they would need those Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports, but this student question was everybody's student and everybody's responsibility. We also knew that we had a responsibility with an equity lens, because we know that historically marginalized groups, particularly in our school, African Nova Scotian students, are most impacted by literacy, low literacy achievement. And we really had a responsibility to respond to that need. We couldn't say, well, if only the parents read to them more, or if only they had more books in the home. We had to make sure that we knew we had these kids for 5 hours a day and we could impact those students and their ability to read for the rest of their lives right now. And we could do all the hand wringing and all the, oh gosh, what are we going to do next? But we decided to be intentional and strategic because those kids needed it and deserved it. And what we wanted to think of was that those Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions, so all of the work with our student services staff, our learning support teachers, all of those had to be within a collaborative framework with the classroom teacher, because we needed those skills to transfer back into the classroom where the majority of the learning was happening. People ask, we've done this presentation a few times, like, well, how did this work here? And maybe it hasn't worked yet in other schools. I think it was really based on the relationships that we all had together. We got lucky, really, in my mind, that we had a staff that was humble enough to know that they needed more in their toolbox and they didn't want to blame kids. We had support staff like our reading recovery teacher, our learning support teacher, speech language pathologist, vulnerable enough to know that they didn't have to be the answer and they didn't want to be the answer. They wanted to be a support to maximize the efficient deployment of our resources. We had me, who was confident enough to say, I don't really know what I'm doing in this field. I need a bunch of smart people to help me out and teach me. So we worked together over the next 6 months to support students strategically, intentionally around that lower part of Scarborough's rope. And I'm going to invite Christine Williams up now to talk about what have we done so far.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christine. I'm a student services consultant for the region. And so I have had the pleasure and the opportunity to work with this school and this staff over the last couple of years, in particular in helping us look at how we increase our student achievement in the area of literacy but through an MTSS lens. So how do we use all of the supports and services that are available to us within this school to support our kids? So on the screen here, you're going to see sort of a bit of a timeline of our what we've done so far, and we're going to have another slide about sort of where we're going and what we're hoping for. Andrew alluded to, and we're all continuing to remind ourselves that this is a learning journey for us. We have sort of adjusted as we've gone and been responsive not only to students' needs, but also to teachers' needs, which I think is really important. So really back in 2021, that initial conversation started with Andrew and his specialist staff here, and also with teachers sort of acknowledging and saying, I'm really struggling and I can't get this student to budge, or I'm not able to move them to the next level, and I'm not sure what else to do. And so collectively, there was an opportunity for people to feel vulnerable and safe here and have those honest conversations. And so through the mechanism of PLCs, professional learning communities, there was more discussions about how can we find out what they know and don't know, what our kids need. And so that first year, with the support of the school psychologist and SLP, they really dug in and used 3 what I would call level A diagnostics. So they're a little bit more in depth than a screener. And that's part of our learning journey, because we started calling them screeners in the beginning and realized as we learned more and we moved through this process that we really were using a level A. And so based on that, there were some discussions around what instructional practices could change to respond to the data that was initially shown in those 3 level A diagnostics. And it was more of the beginning of conversations and the beginning of understanding that we had some gaps. And so the following school year, COVID amongst all of us and school closures and all of those things happening, the conversations continued, and there was a commitment for sure from the staff here that they really wanted to continue on this journey. So really in January of 2022, staff came back after the holiday break and started the 2022 year with a full PD. And really, Andrew spoke to that about sort of grounding the conversation in how does the brain function, and what do we know now with brain science that helps us understand how children learn to read. So based on feedback from teachers, but also the knowledge and the expertise of Kyla and Caitlin, our SLP and school psych, we looked at those diagnostics again and said, how do we make this a little bit more efficient? And how do we use this information to inform our decision-making about Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 supports and services? So they narrowed it down to 2 level A diagnostics. And even within those diagnostics, because they're level A, we were able to sort of adapt and adjust based on grade level, and looking at some recent research around sort of where we would hope, or what skills we hope kids should have based on age and developmentally appropriate grade level expectations. So we administered the 2 level A diagnostics for all students in grades primary through to grade 5. And we started out by initially using, again, PLC as a mechanism to teach teachers about the diagnostics, train them on how to do them, work through scheduling to support them with either filling in for their class or having someone come in and help them support with doing the diagnostics. And we also talked about timelines and reasonable expectations so that we could then enter all of that data and gather them back together and then talk about what next. There was definitely a collective feeling that teachers are asked to do a lot of assessment, and they're happy to do that as long as the follow-up after the assessment helps them inform their instruction and their teaching practices and helps them help kids. So we collectively as a team, all of the people that you're going to meet today were part of helping teachers administer diagnostics. and also fill in for teachers and give them time and allow them to get through those processes. Depending on the student or the age level, it took more time or less time, as you would expect. And then we took about 2 days to take all of that raw data and manually enter it into an automated spreadsheet that was created by Caitlin, our SLP, based on the criteria of the diagnostics. We were able to identify if students needed some explicit teaching in a specific area, needed some review, or had mastered the skill. And so once that data was all entered and collected, we sat down with teachers and PLCs again, shared the data sets with them, and helped them walk through how to analyze that, how to understand what that meant, and also start making some decisions about Tier 1 instructional practices, but also Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports and services. So in the picture on this screen, it's actually one of the groups where we sat and looked through initially some of the data sets and started making some decisions. The initial data, and you're going to get a snapshot of this in a few slides, was to our teachers at points sometimes alarming, because it felt overwhelming because there were some significant gaps. So we continued to reinforce and support the concept that, we're going to use this information and support you in the areas that you need to change instructional strategies in our classrooms to meet the needs of the kids where they are with the information that we have now. So that began about March, and then we sort of had a bit of a plan to support the learning of teaching some of those skills. And so that looked like knowledge building and responding to teachers through structured literacy PD when they were all together, and that was built into the year plan. But also we offered lunch and learns that were hosted by many of the people that you're going to meet today, and they were topic specific and they were optional. But the staff was very committed here, and we were very, very fortunate that they were excited to be part of those discussions and part of that learning. The SAC here provided lunch for the staff every time we came together to learn, and we leveraged that as much as possible, as well as continued time with their PLCs. There was a website that was developed in-house to start also feeding and using some of the information that we were learning together and from each other to house in one area. And then at the end of this school year, we were able to take those 2 level A diagnostics and use them again to help us see where we were. Had we made growth? Were there areas that we needed to focus in more so on? Was what we were doing working? And something that came up continually was that teachers were starting to build sort of anecdotal comments with each other around changes they were seeing in their kids. And they were excited about it because kids were becoming involved, and for the first time they felt like they were reaching all their kids. However, when their data sets came through, I think that only reinforced that this change was significant and that this was definitely moving in the right direction. So the next slide on where we're going is going to be Kyla. So I'm going to get her to introduce herself, and she'll talk about what our hopes are as we move forward. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kyla McLeod, a school psychologist. Just going to briefly tell you about where our next steps are, where we're headed next, and then we'll look at some of the data of what we've gathered so far. Our next steps, we're looking at continuing our learning process, so continuing our professional learning with teachers, collaborative conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis, really, about the students in their classes, how class-wide supports are going, small group supports, individual supports. We are also have had interest from other schools and colleagues in other buildings. So we've been supporting some conversations with other schools in developing their process. We've also been continuously looking at how we evaluate the impact that we're having. looking at the screener data with some pre and post measures, evaluating individual reading levels, listening to the students, parents, teachers, the impact that they're seeing at home and at school. And we've also had the benefit of having some documentation of our process happening through support of researchers at the University of Ottawa, looking at the process of change that we've been going through and the process of learning that we've been going through in developing these skills in our classroom and supporting our teachers. And next, I'm going to pass you back to Andrew to look at some of the initial data that we've been collecting.
Thanks, Kyla. So just for some context, I know provincially there's different initiatives. We call it Focus on Literacy here, but it's really that attention being paid to the P3 students coming out of COVID, and how are they doing and what are we doing to support their learning? Because we know the younger you are, the more likely you were to be impacted, your learning was to be impacted by COVID. So in CCRCE, and maybe it's the same elsewhere, I'm not entirely sure, but we have 3 different kinds of categories for student achievement with Fountas and Fennell instructional reading levels. So if you're meeting, you're at or above the grade level. If you're approaching, you're within 1 or 2 levels of the benchmark. And if you're limited, you're beyond those 2 levels. So a quick snapshot of some of our, what we think are some improvements. And Caitlin will take you through our screener data here in just a moment. But in September 2021, 42% of our students were in the meeting category. End of year was 64%. That was reflective probably of regionally, a very similar stat. One of the things we wanted to focus on as well, though, was the needs of our African Nova Scotian students. And so one of the things I'm very proud to say is that in September of 2021, almost half of our African Nova Scotian students in P3 were in the limited category, and we've dropped that down to 11%. So they're within striking distance now, and we've had a number of teachers say, I just wish I had some more time with them. As well in the limited category, more broadly, in September 2021, we had 53 students. That actually didn't even include our primaries. That was just grade 1 to 3 in the limited category. And then when we add the primary students in at the end of the school year that we just had, we had 15 students in the limited category. So if you can imagine the difference that would feel like to a classroom teacher, a reading recovery teacher, a learning support teacher, 15 students, yeah, like I can handle that. 53 students, that's a very different conversation about what types of supports are even possible for those kids and who gets left behind based on those decisions. So that's a 71.6 reduction in students requiring what we would describe as a tier 3 literacy intervention, because they are within that striking distance now of the benchmark. Kyla will talk a little bit about her own experience in terms of what psych ed referrals that typically come at the end of a school year after a student has struggled in grade 1, 2, and 3. And also a reading recovery teacher, if she were here, she would be able to celebrate a huge number of successes for her. The speed with which she was able to move students up levels, the fact that by the end of the school year, we didn't have a grade 1, or sorry, we had 0 grade 1s and 1 grade primary who would be in the limited category. So almost no students meeting the criteria for reading recovery. And this coming on the heels of 50% of our reading recovery FTE had been redistributed by need elsewhere in the region. So we were actually down reading recovery at our site because it was needed elsewhere. But through the instruction we've been able to do at the tier 1 level and with more strategic tier 2 and 3 approaches, reading recovery teachers been able to work with all the students that would meet the criteria. So I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin Mansfield, who's with us virtually, and she'll talk a bit about our diagnostic data.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm similar to Andrew, I'm losing my voice, so I do apologize. As Andrew said, I'm Caitlin Mansfield. I'm the speech language pathologist at New Glasgow Academy. So in addition to New Glasgow Academy, I also work in 2 schools in the Pictou County area. I support students and staff from grades primary all the way up to 8, and I've had the pleasure of working at NGA for the past 4 years. As Christine had mentioned, there were 2 diagnostic tools that we had administered, specifically looking at that word recognition component of Scarborough's reading rope that was on an earlier slide. And so all of those components are necessary. So the language comprehension, but also that word recognition. And so that was really the area that we focused on because it's a foundational level skill that all other skills build upon. And so the 2 diagnostic tools that we did, as mentioned, were the quick phonological awareness test, which looks at sound awareness, so being able to hear sounds and words. And then we also looked at decoding. And so being able to apply letter sound knowledge to reading words. And so for that decoding measure, we administered that for primary all the way up to grade 5. That's the data I have here that I'm going to speak about in a minute. And really we set benchmarks for each grade level. So that decoding survey, it starts with CVC words, so very simple words like mat or sip. And then what happens is it gradually increases in complexity. So then we look at students' ability to read words with blends, for example. So 2 consonant letters that go together with a short vowel like spin or clasp. And then it moved up all the way to multisyllabic words. And so the benchmarks were different based on grade level. And so this really is just a snapshot of the data that we collected in March and then again in June. And so when we collected the data, we started to have conversations around, is there a class-wide need? Is there a small group need or is there individual need? And so really thinking about supporting students within those tiers. And so the first question again was, is there a class-wide need? And so for us, the criteria that we used was if students were approaching 35% to 40% below mastery on a specific skill, that would indicate a class-wide need. And so here for our grade 1, just looking at pre-CVC, we had 30% of kids at that level that were mastering, being able to read CVC words. We had 46% who required intensive. But then looking at our post data, we reduced that from 46% needing intensive down to 6% requiring intensive support in reading CVC words. And we went up in the mastery. So 30% mastered pre and then 61% post. So then again, for grade 2, if you could go to the next slide there, Andrew, thank you so much. So similarly, again, we looked at a wide variety of skills, but I'm just going to show here CVC, blends, and digraph words. We had only 40% of our students who were mastering CVC words, 21% who required intensive. And in June, when we reassessed using that decoding measure, we moved students out of the intensive, and we ended up getting 67% of students who mastered reading CVC. And for all the skills, you'll notice that there was a reduction in intensive and an increase in students needing review or mastery. And then next slide, Andrew. Thank you so much. And then again, grade 3, this is just another example of the data that we collected. So again, you'll notice from pre to post, there was a movement from intensive to reducing that intensive and moving students into review and mastery of those select skills. Okay, you can move to the next slide there, Andrew.
Okay, thanks very much, Caitlin. I'm going to invite Kim Bain, our learning support teacher, who has been a fantastic support for all the teachers and the lead team over the last number of months, to share a bit of an impact on students and teachers.
Hi everyone, as Andrew mentioned, I'm Kim, and I do learning support for primary to grade 3 students here at the Glasgow Academy. So throughout this initiative, I've seen huge impacts on the students, on myself as a teacher, and also among my colleagues as well. So I'm going to start with the impact on the teachers first, over on the right-hand side of the page. The biggest impact for me right off the bat was the increase in knowledge and the time that was spent with our lunch and learns and PD to help us gain that knowledge about how children learn to read. So, and how to know where to start. Now that we have this information, how do we know where to start? How do we go about this? So we were supported all along the way with all of those steps, which was really nice. It doesn't leave it on one teacher to feel overwhelmed. So it was really nice to take small steps at a time as a team and move on from there. The next bullet is our staff, our teachers in primary to 3 have a greater confidence in identifying the student needs. So by the use of our screening tools, we're now feeling confident that, okay, I can identify what the need of the student is, and then I can also talk about with my colleagues or plan the next steps as to where to go. Because sometimes I know in learning support, when I get a new student, oftentimes teachers would come to me and say, I'm not really sure what they need, but I've done everything I can. So it would take me some time to filter through some things and do some assessments. And I'm spending a lot of time trying to figure out where the need was. But now with the screening tools, I can really zone in and target a very specific skill that they might have missed early on that's been impacting the reading. So I now, as a teacher and my colleagues as well, we feel more confident that we can take a look at the screening data, find their need, and go about planning from where they need. So it's very intentional and intense and very specific to the need of the student. The next bullet point is teachers feel they're meeting the needs of all the students in their room. We always felt like there were a small percentage that we left behind, that we're like, I've run out of tricks, I don't know what else to do. They really haven't progressed as much as I'd like them to. So we feel we're meeting all the needs of our students now because we have that missing piece from that. We can identify the missing piece, fill that in, and all of our students are feeling success. So it's a great feeling. Another big impact on us as teachers we really feel like we have a stronger support system now. We're collaborating with ourselves through our lunch and learns, but also just in the hallways and in casual conversations. We're bouncing ideas off each other. Every one of us has said, I don't know how to do something, or I don't have all the answers. And it's been really empowering being able to be vulnerable and say that I don't know what to do. Can you help? I had a teacher come to me asking about she had looked at her screener data, wondered where to go next or where to start with her whole class instruction. I wasn't quite sure. I had an idea, wasn't quite sure. So I fired off a text to our speech language pathologist, Caitlin, and then she got back to me right away. So it's a really nice team effort. So we are collaborating, and it's wonderful that myself as a program support teacher, I can chat with the classroom teachers about a student that I have from their room, and I can sort of carry over what they're doing in the classroom or help fill in some gaps for students that are struggling. So it's really nice to have that collaboration. And the bottom one, hopeful. We're feeling energized and hopeful. The last 3 years have been really difficult, and we feel like we're not making much progress, and our students aren't making any gains. But since we've been doing this and really focusing in on the skill that the student's missing, we're seeing results, and it's exciting, and we want to do more, and our kids are having fun. So we're very hopeful, and we're raring to go in September again. So the impact on the students has been lovely to see. We're seeing them engaged in activities, excitement and engagement. And I will hear things outside my door at the end of the day, like, oh, Max, your name starts with a sound, or so-and-so, your name is a CVC word. So I'm hearing the conversations in the hallways that the kids are carrying over just in their social time with their friends, and lots of excitement and energy in the classroom with the activities. It's something, a lot of times people think these type of activities are, well, isn't it boring? But no, the kids are enjoying them. They're fun. They're word games. We're having letter games. They did one of the classes did an Easter egg scavenger hunt with letters on words. So the kids are very excited. So lots of engagement. We're seeing their confidence grow. Each of the students are seeing themselves as readers. Even our most struggling readers are now reading words in simple books. So. And we're seeing improvement in success, as you saw in the data earlier as well. And we're seeing a joy in learning, a rejuvenation and a joy in teachers and students. So it's been wonderful overall. So I'm excited to have been a part of this. I'm going to introduce you to Janet Bawagnasai. I'll let her go from there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Balagnessa. I'm Coordinator of Student Services for CCRCE. And so mine is more, I guess I'll just speak for a few minutes just about the bigger picture regionally. So backing up to implementing the inclusive education policy, and we were trying to use the framework of MTSS within student services, and recognizing that despite the infusion of numerous inclusive education positions into student services, that as a department, our data was still heavy at tier 3 with lots of referrals, large wait lists, not enough time to get to the interventions that were required. And so our focus was really on how to provide support differently across tiers. So we've been working towards a workload distribution model across tiers, and changing our practices and giving permission, I guess, to our speech and psych to support at the tier 1 level using instructional or evidence-based practices to support teachers at the classroom level. And so what I think you've heard so far is that our SLP and our psych that work here at NGA are really true members of this staff. I think I forgot to change the slide. There we go. Are really true members of this staff. They're well-respected colleagues with the teachers and administration in this building. They really have expanded their scope and practice of their respective professions. And I think what you're also seeing here is that this work that's happened around literacy in this building, and which could happen for any potential change that a school was willing to make, is really a true implementation of an MTSS model where students' needs are being met across tiers, and it's very responsive to them, it's very data informed, and it's utilizing all those supports across all of the tiers. And what we're seeing in the data so far at NGA is that students who require a service or support at a different tier are getting that service. And so we don't have that long list of referrals. We don't have increased numbers of IPPs, and students' needs are being met. And I think we've also seen an increase in the well-being of students and staff as a result of the work that is happening here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kyla and Caitlin just to talk about impact on school and supports as a psychologist and speech language pathologist.
So again, I'm Kyla, the psychologist, and I think one of the biggest changes in my role that I've seen is that the many referrals that we get for psych ed assessments often was really, kind of overwhelming, not being able to get to everybody. And the change that we've had has had more impact on supporting tier 1. So we have been doing lots of in-class support and supporting the teachers to support their students in the classroom every day. So many of the referrals that we would receive for psych ed assessments would be for reading challenges, probably the majority of referrals. And so many assessments that were completed, we were seeing lots of identifying deficits in decoding skills and phonics skills, which really conversations between myself and Caitlin, our speech pathologist, wondering, are we truly seeing learning disabilities here, or are we seeing something else, like something missing from the curriculum? And as we implemented more of the tier 1 supports with the teachers in the classrooms, we were seeing really a prevention of the need for those further assessments, those psych ed assessments, and really like what is probably a prevention of learning disabilities in the long run. We know that some of these deficits can be prevented with systematic instruction and support, and having that as on a daily basis really makes a difference. I think the impact as we continue this work is that we're hopeful that with the daily systematic instruction that students are seeing, that we'll see, well, we've already seen fewer referral requests for psych ed assessments because students are not showing those deficits that they were previously. And that we'll see too that the students that still do require a psych ed assessment will be much more, it'll be a much more clear assessment. We'll know what supports they've had. Those supports will have been systematic and will have gone through tiers of support. So we'll know what they've received in the classroom at Tier 1. We'll know what small group specific instruction they've received at Tier 2. So for those students that do eventually receive a learning disability diagnosis, we'll know that that's a true reflection of their abilities, and we'll also have a much better picture of what areas of deficit that they're showing, and it's much more of a team approach in terms of remediation and support following an assessment. So we know, as Kim mentioned, we know very specifically about what students need, and we know that early on due to our screeners. So we can see where kids are struggling early. We can really try to treat and prevent those challenges. And eventually, if they do need a psych ed assessment, I think it gives us a much more clear picture of the supports they've had. So I see, in terms of my role with the MTSS, it is a shift in practice, but we're reaching much more larger groups of students and really having a better impact on those students that we see at a tier 3 level. And Caitlin, I'll pass on to you, and you can fill in on your role as well.
Thanks so much, Kyla. Yeah, just really to echo what Kyla had mentioned in regards to assessments. So historically, myself and conversations with other speech language pathologists, we've kind of been stuck at a Tier 2 and Tier 3 support. Oftentimes, long assessment wait lists. And then when you do the assessment wait lists, it's then you will be the sole provider to provide those supports for that student. And so because of that, started to have conversations with Kyla about, okay, if we have this many assessments, we have long wait lists for intervention, let's start asking those questions about Tier 1. And so part of my organization that I belong to, Speech, Language, and Audiology Canada, they've recently released a position statement which talks about speech language pathologists' roles in schools. And part of that position statement is challenging speech language pathologists to think creatively about new service delivery models within that MTSS framework. And so rather than doing that traditional response of Tier 2, Tier 3 support, sometimes in isolation, looking at how do we provide supports at that Tier 1 level when there's a need, shifting to focusing on prevention and early identification into more collaborative services. And so really, with the work that we've done as a school in the last 2 years, I really feel that I'm able to provide a more systematic approach to supporting students and staff at NGA. So we have the data, and then we can get responsive with that data so we know what students' needs are, and we can be sure that they're getting the services that they need, and we're filling in those gaps that our students are demonstrating. Okay.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is the end of our presentation. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions for anybody who does have one. I think I'll leave these key lessons up on the screen. Just highlight them a little bit. The idea that this is not about holding teachers accountable for their practice, but rather making them feel empowered to take responsibility for the kids in front of them. They have the care, they have the intelligence, they just needed the tools to be a little different and some of the context to be a little different. And we have high expectations, but high beliefs for them, high beliefs in their capabilities and their own potentials. What we've also learned is that this doesn't happen if it's a thou must intervention. This was these conversations began very early, and they were really supportive of teachers' practice, really leveraging what they'd already been doing. Success is growing exponentially. So as Kim mentioned, some of those conversations are just happening naturally. They're not waiting for the next PD session to be presented to them. They're going out and looking for it, and they're having conversations together. And the last thing I think that is probably worth highlighting is that a lot of conversations that you hear in schools as well, it's COVID, we can't ask any more of teachers. What we believed here is that a sense of purpose and a sense of accomplishment is actually sustaining. And when it's the right work, it actually can keep teachers motivated, can keep them resilient, because they see the power and the impact on the kids. And it wasn't about, what's on the cart, what's off the cart, how many horses do they have to pull the cart, so to speak, but rather that as success grew, they were more sustained. And as they had that sense of purpose in the work, they were more sustained. So that's where we're at on July 25th, 2022. We have some ideas of where we're going in September. We're going to continue this work. We're going to continue to build the capacity and try to document our process. But that's where we're at for now. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today. I want to thank you to the lead team. They're here over the summer in a school without any kind of central air system. So we're all doing our best not to stick to our chairs here. And I just want to say thank you. And we'll open it up to questions if anybody has any. I'll ask Caitlin Mansfield to respond to Janet May's questions there, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just read that out loud if that's okay, so everybody knows what the question was. So the first question from Janet: did you make the decoding survey in-house, or did you use a pre-made one? That's a great question. So it was a pre-made one. The specific name of it is the Core Phonics Survey. So that's a free decoding instrument that you can find online. And what I didn't mention was that there's a scoring rubric, and so that's how you can make decisions around whether or not a specific skill requires intensive support, review, or mastery. And in terms of the tier 1 or 2 interventions that we used, we didn't have a specific box program. Really, our focus was to continue to develop knowledge building and responding to the data that we collected in March. And so really the framework we used was, for those specific skills, was using explicit and systematic construction to target phonics and phonemic awareness. And so really just looking at what research recommends and supporting those skills, we created kind of like an instructional framework of what this could look like. I'm also, Kim Bain, I know that in your role, because you supported that tier 2, tier 3 level, perhaps you can add to that.
Okay. I don't have my reading glasses here. I'm reading, what types of tier 1 and tier 2 interventions did you use, and what did they look like? I went into some classrooms to support classrooms with some tier 1, but what ended up happening is it was looking a little bit like, I don't feel it was true tier 1. I was doing sort of some small group instruction within the classroom. So next year, I'm looking forward to starting some whole group interventions with letters and sounds with the younger grades. So I did some tier 2 interventions within the groups, doing small group lessons on a skill that they needed. So if it was short vowel sounds, I would take the students that were identified in that classroom as struggling with short vowel sounds, and I would work with a group while the teacher worked on another group with a different skill. So we had a bigger bang for our buck with the two of us going at it at once. I also pulled some groups into my room for small group intervention. Teachers had targeted a need for certain students, but it really wasn't working within the classroom. So I would pull them into my small room and do that. And if there were some students that were still continuing to struggle, I would pull them one-on-one. So I do some tier 3 stuff as well. But the teachers, we have developed that trust and relationship building, because it's not easy to walk into someone's classroom and or to invite someone into your classroom to support. So it was nice when we had the time and the trust, and we could chat together about what we wanted to look at. And the students that were still struggling, then they stay on a little bit longer with me outside of the classroom. I hope I answered that question. Okay, sorry.
Want to give an example of like a teacher's lesson?
Yes. So Andrew asked me to give you an example of a lesson that I've seen in a classroom setting. So in one particular grade 1 classroom I was in, the students were working on word sorts. So sorting words by I believe it was the final sounds. So they had little chart paper, a little chart stand, and pictures of words ending with the T sound. And the students had to sort them and organize them by that. So whatever skill the teacher taught, she would reinforce as a whole group, she would reinforce in smaller groups. I've seen students go on word scavenger hunts in the classroom, looking for words that were CBC or words with the short U sound, and very excited when they would find one. It had added a lot of variety, even at some of the guided reading groups that were happening. It really helped teachers focus in on what might a mini lesson be. Although they were doing guided reading lesson, they would use some of that small group instruction time to really focus on things that were identified in the screeners, which then helped them through the reading of their level text. That's
Thanks, Caitlin and Kim. One of the things I will mention that I guess the easy thing for me to do was spend school money. And one of the asks from the teachers was for every student to have their own set of magnetic letters. So we bought a set for every student, P to 5. And what we found was we had a lot of engagement with students having that tactile experience of being able to, in a full class, like a tier 1 whole class instruction, having their own letters in front of them and being able to sort through those letters with their neighbor or just themselves. And the teachers asked for that, and that was an easy thing to say yes to, because it just made sense to me, as opposed to having 4 sets in the classroom. Every student kind of had ownership of it, and that was a big element to just trying to respond to what the teachers thought that their kids needed. That's 2:30. I think I'll probably end things there, Brian, just to respect everybody's time. I want to say thank you to everybody and to the team for joining today. If you do have questions, I'm not sure if contacts are shared in this forum, but I know any of our team, we're excited about this work. We spend a lot of time texting in a group chat about all of this. So if there are people out there who are curious about any element of what we've talked about, or some of the struggles we continue to kind of work through, or the complexity we work through, I'm happy to support those conversations, or more likely direct you to the person who has the better answer than me. But I'll say thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the summer, everyone.